So here we are,
Yeah.
back on the Contractor Commute. Welcome,
Awesome.
everybody.
Yeah.
My co-host, Kinsey Batten. Everyone's wondering what happened to Drew, or are you? No. Drew is pursuing another opportunity right now. He's still involved with Congenius, sitting on the board of directors. But Kinsey has a sales and marketing background. We actually got to know each other about 6 years ago when you were selling marketing services to my business.
It's been 6 years. It's been 6 years.
It's 6 years?
That's
what did I
insane.
say?
Yeah, no, I think it has been
it's
6
been
years.
6
I'm
years.
just like, that's a long time.
Highlight the fact. It's been a very long time. Yeah, way back when. And then Kinsey joined the team about 2 years ago at Congenius.
Mm-hmm.
She's a head of sales and marketing here, and had the opportunity to connect with a lot of builders, a lot of contractors. And really, you've been a fast study related to the contracting industry.
Yeah, it's the highlight of my job is connecting with contractors and learning and getting feedback. I love it. So it's my favorite thing.
Yeah. So today, we're just going to dive into some kind of fun stuff.
Yeah. So you were you filling me in early this week on you gotten a call from a contractor, a friend of yours, buddy of yours, and I think you were sharing that he hadn't been paid yet by his customers or a couple or something like that. And so I think we were talking and we were like, man, that'd make a really good podcast show, because we were like, hey, that happens all the time.
I can relate to that.
Yeah, I can relate to it in my previous experiences too. Obviously different business, but so do you want to kind of jump us through that scenario?
I mean, it's one of those. I mean, you could feel the emotions in the call. I mean, he wanted somebody to talk to because the emotions were boiling over, and he was like, okay, Ben, this is what's going on. I feel like suing the pants off this guy. This is where I'm at with it. Yeah. I mean, so the situation was he had one customer that owed him a lot of money. He had been working there for I'm not sure how long of a period of time this stacked up over, but it was probably several months where he had just been working and not submitting invoices. And then he had just submitted an invoice, and then the customer had responded with well, that's a lot of money. And
scary place to be. Scary response.
Right. And wanted him to substantiate what he was billing them for. Gotcha. So do you know, is the material really that much? Is the labor that much? Right. And so he's thinking, am I even going to get paid from this customer? Yeah. And he, obviously there's the emotional response he had, and then then there's other situations going on in life that kind of all tie together. Then you're like, well, what about the other customer that hasn't paid me yet? And you start panicking,
like
right?
Spiraling almost.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that was boiling over, and he was really wanting to bounce that off of me. And I think part of it was just helping him process the emotions of it all, because he was very angry with himself because he knows better than to let 2 months stack up before billing somebody. He's thinking, so stupid. I know better. I should just bill this person. But relationships are built on trust, and he had a lot of trust in this person that he would get paid, and he's busy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there was a combination of anger, frustration, and also this sense of justice or vindictive side of us that comes out when we feel like we've been wronged. It's like, you will pay for that mistake.
Yeah, justice, absolutely. It's moral. It's right.
Right, exactly. You cheat, is kind of what he was feeling.
Sure.
And so I think today, really trying to unpack some of really how to resolve a situation. So number one, the current situation.
Yeah, what should I actually do today?
Yeah. And then also, what can we learn from it moving forward so it doesn't happen again?
Right. Yeah, I think the thing it makes me think of is just like what a high risk point for a contractor. Like, you've got different businesses that have scaled to different levels, obviously. But like, if you're a one-man show or 2 to 5 or whatever that is, like that one invoice that's unpaid can be
it can ruin you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's a big topic and something that should absolutely be addressed. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah. So I guess we talked about options, right? We're prepping for the show. We're thinking, okay, what are the options in this scenario? I mean, you can first off just go legal, right? Just get the lawyer up.
Sure.
I've had situations where people haven't paid me. I've had situations where I've been taken to court and took other people to court, and none of them were nice stories to talk about.
It doesn't end well.
No, I mean, and even situations when you win, you don't really win. You don't never feel like justice had been served. You paid a lot to the lawyers, and you get paid maybe. The other option is you don't get paid at all. You just drop it, and you're just like, well, that's
it is what it is.
It is what it is, right? Or you can try to let it resolve itself, of being like, well, maybe they'll pay me, maybe they won't. Drag it out.
Yeah, which if you're not going to follow up, it's likely never going to happen.
That's a good point.
You're never going to get paid. Yeah.
Right. Okay. If you don't push it, they probably think you don't need it.
Right.
Yeah. And then I guess the other option would be negotiate.
Right.
I mean, where you're saying, and then really where our recommendation is a negotiate, and then also a learning moment
Sure.
from that of
Yeah.
being saying, okay, let's negotiate through this situation, but
Right.
also learn from it. So, I mean, let's
Yeah.
unpack that somewhat.
Yeah, let's do it. So
Yeah.
kind of solving the immediate solution, maybe talk us through like, what do you mean by negotiating? Like, what does that actually look like? What has it looked like for you? Talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the negotiating part, maybe just to define that further, it's conversational. It's not necessarily when we think about negotiating like we're trying to, it's like somebody's getting cheated as a part of negotiation.
Right.
It's really trying to discover. It's a journey of discovery. It's diffusing the emotions, number one.
Yeah.
Because if you approach the conversation with the emotions that my friend is feeling going into this, he needs to talk to this person that owes him money.
Right.
And if he has all of the emotions just boiling over, the first thing that person says to him of like, well, questioning the invoice,
right,
that could just boil over to be like, screw you and be done with it. You know what I mean? Like that could be.
Yeah. Well, and the response could either set it up for failure or success in terms of like the actual negotiation too.
I've learned that if you treat people like crooks, they're likely to act like it. If you make the assumption of saying, I'll sue you, and they're like, well, I'll see you in court. The pride that people have.
I'm going to win. Yeah.
Right. Well, we'll see about that. And whether it's true or not,
Sure.
it's just that the knee-jerk reaction for most people is not to say, oh, really? You're going to sue me? Oh, then here's the money.
Talk it through. Yeah. Right.
No,
you're like, it's fight or flight, right?
Exactly. So diffusing the situation is number one.
Yeah.
Of really saying, okay, let's get to a spot where we're not talking about court. We're not talking about somebody doing wrong or even taking really ascribing a motive to an action.
Yeah.
It's so easy to do, right, Kinsey? I mean, so many times I'll see somebody do something and I think, well, that's the reason why they did it.
Totally.
And it might be totally a different reason.
Yeah. It's your perception of the reason and not the whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So as much as possible, we can just say, well, this is what happened the way I understand it. So let's talk about why that is that way.
Sure.
And let's give that person an opportunity to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's listen first.
Right. And I think one of the things we talked about too was just like ownership. Right? What does actual ownership look like? And like, what is the part of the job that you can actually take, fall on the sword for maybe, or just take ownership of? So maybe what did that look like in the scenario you were talking about, or kind of what did you convey to your friend to convey that point?
A couple things he could own. One is we're waiting 2 months to get an invoice or whatever that time period was. So there's a lot being presented to him at one time.
Sure.
And it's not in the moment. So you're not having that kind of that timely response where he could say, oh, that's a lot of money. What are we doing about it? It's piled up.
Right.
So that's number one you can take responsibility for, saying, yeah, I know this is hitting you out of the blue.
Yeah.
Then the other part about it is sometimes people look for things that are wrong when they have a situation, right? Well, this doesn't work. I wasn't happy about this. I mean, and it seems as like an excuse. Well, look, and it could feel like as a contractor, they're trying to cheat me.
Right.
As opposed to being like, acknowledging those things like, okay, that is part of the equation. Okay. So we can solve all of those things. This doesn't work. That doesn't work. You weren't happy about that. All that's a separate, but related thing. Yeah. And we can acknowledge those things. Because a lot of times we are all or nothing. Yeah. We either are right or we're wrong, totally. And they're feeling the same way. You're right. You're wrong. Yeah. And we can say, no, you're wrong. Yeah. And we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah. I think you spoke to pride a little bit ago too, about like just the importance of not having pride in this kind of scenario. Yeah. And so like it requires not having pride to actually even see the fault that you played in something. And so being able to actually take ownership of something requires the humility side of that, of like, I'm actually going to self-reflect on this and discover what it is that I can own and what's maybe on them, and then just communicate. I think even leading with like, hey, this is what I did wrong, like to the customer that you're talking to, versus being like, well, this is why, this is why, this is why. Like opening it up with, hey, I know that I like sent that invoice out late or didn't communicate as well throughout the process, but like almost like starting the conversation with ownership, and then like that way it kind of like disarms them a little bit too. Yeah. And I think that that's an important place to go.
And going with the same theme there, Kinsey, I think the other thing that was true in this situation was there was a relationship prior to this happening. So this is not the first time these guys had worked together.
I gotcha.
And so he could say, he could reference a previous relationship, like they're friends to whatever degree they were, and he could say, we've worked together, we've worked well together, you've always paid me on time, and he could call greatness out of that person instead of calling the negative out. Sure. A lot of times, even when we don't have that kind of relationship, we can always call the greatness out of somebody and say, I know you want to do the right thing. I know you want to do the fair thing here, and I do too. Yeah. So let's discover what that is.
Yeah, because I know who you are as a person. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. It's interesting because in construction too, it's so referral based that it's like most of not all, but especially starting out, most of your connections are people you know.
Yeah.
So it's like a complex scenario of like, how do I stay friends with this person, be excellent, and get referrals at the same time? You know, like it's very complex. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And I think the question part of it too, not in an antagonistic way, but just saying, help me understand your perspective.
Sure.
That is simple, as much as we can, to let that other person tell us how they're thinking about it, and then write that out down as you're going through it. That's one thing we forgot to talk about too is the forum for the conversation.
Oh yeah, we did.
You know, I've tried text messages, I've tried emails, they don't work.
Don't
you
do
can't
that.
convey. Don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah, I mean, and I think what we like about text messages is it's a closed conversation, and in the sense of you don't have a response in the moment. It feels as though it's something you can control, right? Because you are writing the message to them.
Yeah, you can erase it as many times as you want before you hit send, right?
And you can change what you said, and you can feel like you're prepared. But what you do is, instead of the text message, you get a pad of paper or get your computer open and type out what the kind of the outline of what you want to say. Yeah. And then it needs to be a phone call or it needs to be an in-person meeting. And you just have your notes with there and you say, okay, these are what I think are the main things here that we need to talk about. And you can write down what they say. But I've always found it's so much, I mean, how do you express to somebody that you're their friend in a text message? Yeah, that you still want both of you to win. Right. How do you diffuse that tension that builds when someone says, when they read into your text message as saying they called me a crook? Yeah. Good luck. You know, it's suddenly,
nothing comes through a text.
Yeah. I had a moment like that, actually. I learned this from an electrical contractor, and I had this moment where I was a little frustrated with him, and I just said, you know, these outlets don't work. This is the problem. And he said, let's just talk about it. And for me, I thought that was kind of an appropriate thing to put in a text message because it was somewhat more fact-based. Mm-hmm. But even in his case, though, he saw emotion in it. Right. And he said, let's talk about it.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good response.
It really was. Yeah. And I thought, wow, even to that level of being like, not that you can't document, not that you can't create a paper trail afterwards and say, hey, these are the things, follow it up with an email, follow up with a text.
This is what we discussed.
Yeah, right. Sound, agreed?
Yeah. Is this what you heard? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because, I mean, that could be different after the fact as well.
That feels like a lot of steps, though, So it's like, I think to speak to, like, maybe a contractor whose hair's on fire and running 1,000,000 miles a minute, like, setting aside any time to actually, like, reflect and write that on a document. And, you know what I mean? It's an interesting maybe shift in mindset of like actually the importance of every conversation that you have is either building your brand, because I'm a marketing person, right? So I got to like have a little plug there. It's building your brand or it's hurting it. And so in every interaction you have is it building it or is it hurting it? And so I don't know. It's an interesting
You could be burning bridges without really trying to. Down the road, that's a negative review or a customer that knows other people. If nothing else, if you can keep your reputation intact, and maybe at the end of the day you realize, man, I shouldn't have been working for that person. Yeah. Their idea of what was fair and my idea of what fair are two different things. Totally different. And I've been that guy, quite frankly. I remember the first time I probably hired somebody to do something else, being the fact that I usually did things myself, I probably undervalued them. I probably thought, it took them 3 days to do something I feel like should take a day. And they're charging me, you know what I mean? Like it can feel, and they're probably thinking, I was hustling. I got, pay me for 3 days.
What do they know? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, there's probably, there's differences there. I've had several people tell me, well, this is fair. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't seem fair at all.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So what are some ways to like actually negotiate? Like what are examples of like, okay, if I'm going to negotiate, where can you bend as a contractor or not? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think in this situation we're talking about, if you're in a spot where maybe there wasn't a contract, there's not something to reference at the beginning, there's probably a lack of clarity at the beginning of the project, and so you're trying to just reconcile. You're trying to create a win out of something that just feels wrong, right? And like you're thinking, this could really go south. Yeah. And so I think part of that is recognizing, okay, in order for this to be a double win, in order for them to win and for me to win, we're probably both going to have to budge a little bit. Yeah. And so to be prepared in the conversation, like, I want to get paid 100%, and I feel like I earned every dollar of that. But I probably am not going to. That's probably not going to happen at this point because, the business process wasn't there. I wasn't timely with my payments, my invoices, and all the rest. So at that point, you're saying, okay, let's try to listen to that person, hear out what they think is fair, and say, okay, how do we resolve this? And let them kind of speak to it as well. Give them some agency in it as well. You're not prescribing what needs to happen, and then you have being that last person to speak in the conversation sometimes helps too, where you're saying, tell me what you think is fair here. Yeah. And if it just seems like, oh my word, they just want the farm. Yeah. Then you're thinking, well, how about this instead?
Yeah. Listen first.
Yes.
That's what you just said. Yeah. That's so good. Yeah.
So, and then sometimes the issue is not the issue either, where somebody says, I'm not going to pay you. Maybe the bills just stacked up to the point where they're thinking, I don't even have that kind of money.
Right.
And so maybe it's payment plans. Maybe it's giving them an opportunity of saying, okay, I'll give you 25% off the whole job. Just pay me by the end of the month.
Yeah.
Or give me, can we get a check this week? Being creative.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It makes me wonder though, like, how do you get to that point? Because it's like, obviously for the customer, if they're like, I can't pay this, I don't want to tell you that.
No.
Like as a contractor, right? I'm like, I'm not going to tell you that I'm broke,
right.
As the customer. So it's like, how do you break through the noise and like actually level with someone to like kind of come to the truth of like, what was the actual issue?
Yeah.
Is it, oh, I just didn't have the funds? Then it's like, maybe it's not even your fault as the contractor, right? And then, so talk me through that. Like, how do you get there?
I think part of it is also being vulnerable enough where you show your side of the equation as well. And I think a lot of times we hide that because we're thinking, well, you just pay me what I tell you need to pay me. I've had many times had to go back and say, well, here's my material list. Here's what I paid other suppliers for stuff. This is what I paid my labor. This is what my overhead cost. So just for me to walk away from this job and not lose money, this is what I would need to pay.
Yeah.
And so I'm not making any dollars off of you. I could stay home and make the same money, but this is what I would need to cover that. And then you're letting them know I'm being vulnerable to share with you all the details. You can see the numbers. And I think that helps them too, because they're realizing when they tell you, hey, I want it for $5,000 and you're saying, well, I have $7,000 of costs. Then they can start realizing, okay, the $10,000 you billed, if I just paid $7,000, we both walk away, nobody, that might be the win in the situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you say that because it's like almost like going back to the beginning is what it sounds like of like, okay, we're reopening the estimate and like what we agreed on and then like where we fell short or where, what happened from there. So it's like, to me, I'm just like hearing, man, the importance of the estimate so that way you can kind of come back to it and even like
you need
work
something
through that
to come
together.
back to.
Yeah.
Really. And it's so hard to create that level of clarity in a document at the beginning.
Right.
I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I mean, I think, setting the expectations in this negotiation process as well as you guys discuss solutions of being like, okay, if I'm hearing you, if we're negotiating and I could repeat, if I'm hearing you correctly, you could pay me this amount of money by the end of this week and then this amount of money by the end of the week, or by the end of the month. And is that fair? Obviously I would love to get paid what I think the job's worth, but I understand the situation. We're trying to solve something at the end of it. And I've had that negotiation point with people and I've had to walk away from it saying, this is painful. Yeah. I want the full amount of money. And it hasn't happened a lot, but enough where I remember the pain.
Yeah. And I think too, like to your point of like ownership earlier of like, okay, what are you going to fix? What expectations are you setting too? Like, yes, your customer's setting payment expectations, but it's like, are you also setting expectations prior to getting paid again?
Yes.
Like, do you need to go back out and fix outlets? Do you need to go back out and fix drywall patches? Do you need to, like, what is it that you're owning and, agreeing to again, and maybe put that in writing too, so that you have it to come back to also and in the customer. So it feels like it's written and it's a win-win.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Where you're saying this is the settlement package essentially where I'm going to fix these things at that point I will get paid. I've had a couple times too, if you're in a sidewise relationship with somebody, sometimes it's just the best thing to do of saying, I don't want to blame you for the fact that there's not trust here, but clearly we're on two different pages here. Yeah. So how do we reconcile things where I'm happy, you're happy, and there are other people that can pick up where we left off?
Yeah, right.
And sometimes you just want to be done with the relationship.
Yeah, wash your hands of it. Yeah.
Right. And I've had a few moments where it was better to just say, okay, I'm going to take a discount because I don't want to be going back. I had one client where we just couldn't be done with the project. It was constantly one more thing.
Like change order type thing.
Change order. I just couldn't keep up with the pace of it. It was dizzying.
Yeah.
He would say, let's add 5 external lights. And this was part of a big remodel project. Let's add 5 lights outside. We'd have the 5 lights installed. Let's add 5 more. Yeah. The electrician was just there yesterday. So it was a huge frustration to me. Or gutters. Everything was like that. Let's put downspout here, downspout there. And I'm like, whatever you want, have the gutter guy take care of. We want you happy. Yeah. Next day. Well, and I'm thinking we need one more downspout. I'm like, oh no, I just could never be done with the guy. And if it came down to just saying, let's just settle up. There are other people that can finish things. And,
It's a referral.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. Here's a guy that, you work directly with the gutter guy. Right. But let's square up. And it ended up me taking less money than I would have wanted to. Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, that's good. Talk me through like the goals of like, hey, we're dealing with this situation. Why is it best to deal with the situation? One of the things we talked through was one, to preserve relationships. We talked about referrals being a source of business, especially for contractors starting out. It's like, hey mom, do you have a friend? Like, that is like how you build your business is Facebook. Who do you know? Those kinds of things. So it's like, talk me through the goals of like, why is it better to resolve the, and negotiate and learn upfront?
Your reputation, your integrity, if you can maintain that and keep that intact, even if you came to a situation where you don't want to work with that person ever again, and they might not never want to work with you again, but if you can still maintain your integrity in that situation, where you always keep in front of the customer, I want to do the right thing by this. And I think we have a different idea of what that is, and that's okay. We can be okay with a disagreement. And we've tried to come up with a double win where they won, we won, to whatever extent that was. They might feel like, I don't want to work with that guy again, and you feel like, they, at the end of the day, they took advantage of you. Right. But at the same time, you maintain your reputation, your integrity. I think that's what it really comes down to. That's priceless, right? Your integrity in a conversation like that. Because at the end of the day, that person will never go to other people and say, what a jerk. They're just going to say, you know what, it didn't work out. And they don't have something negative. But he handled himself well, herself well, like whatever.
They
weren't angry. They weren't, they weren't explosive. They weren't vindictive. They were very, they stuck with the facts. And I remember I had one situation that really stands out where I had a customer seemed to be irrational, where there was nothing I could say that seemed to get through to it. And it was very tempting to just tell them where to go. It was very tempting. And he was that way, well,
it's like every interaction is emotional at that point.
Right. And it was all text message from his side. Like he would never have a phone call. And if it was a phone call, it was the level 10, emotions involved. And it was a very small transaction. We're talking $1,500.
Typically that's the way it is.
Yeah. $1,500 transaction. And he wanted that $1,500. And we negotiated. I gave him half off. Wow. I said, you don't have to pay the balance of it, but we did a little bit of work here. You already paid it. Let's just call it good. Yeah. He was not okay with it. He wanted zero. He didn't want to pay a dime. And to the point of making threats. But I always kept it just to the facts. And his wife was involved in some of the conversation, and it was always fact-based. I would never compromise my integrity in that situation. And I wish I could say that I always handle myself that way. But that
wow, great job, Ben. That's excellent. Thanks. Not all of us are that way.
It was like my grandfather. I remember my dad telling me that my grandfather's an architect, and somebody came to him and said, "Can you send me your references?" And he said, "Well, do you want the good ones or the bad ones?" So I'm giving you the good ones. But it was one of those situations where, and I learned that of just being like, let's just stick with the situation as opposed to trying to get into the emotion part of it. Let's not deal with any of the emotions. Let's not deal with the assumptions. Just stick with the facts. And then you have the integrity. So I think that's the bottom line for me, is preserving that in those conversations.
It's really good. And back to the brand side.
Nobody will have something. I mean, they can say whatever they want to say, but you can hold your head up high and say, I know I did the right thing to the best I could.
Yeah, and you're probably also preventing a negative review or something like that. Like they're not going to go off on you on social media, things like that, if you handle yourself with integrity. That's good.
And you didn't make it personal. Never make it personal.
That's good.
So tempting though.
That's so good. So how can we? All right, we talked about how to deal with it, how to negotiate, how do we actually solve the immediate situation. How do we learn from it? What should we do moving forward? How do we avoid getting back to that spot?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that stands out to me when we go through a painful situation, a lot of times we want to get through the pain as fast as possible, right? Sure. Who wants pain? I mean, none of us do, right? No. So we want to just jump to the other side of it, and we also want to sort of prescribe blame to the other person entirely. 100% of the fault was to that other person. They're a jerk. They're a cheat. They're disreputable person. I'll never want to work with them again. And therefore, 100% of the blame went to that person, and we're going to move on to much better and nicer customers. That's the lesson to be learned. As opposed to saying, no, what? I mean, maybe that was 80% of that customer's fault. Maybe they really had very poor expectations that were very demanding and demeaning and all the rest of it. But at the same time, what 20% of that can I acknowledge? And it's a very mature response and a very difficult one to arrive at. Because everything about you wants to just say, I mean, it's sort of like any other emotional situation, whether that's conflict in any other relationship, whether that's marriage or family, whatever. You got a family member that's ticked off. It's you want to just say, hey, it's their fault, not me.
Write them off. Done.
Right, done. So I think that's been a big part of really resolving things, is just saying, okay, in order to learn, you have to acknowledge some responsibility. I think you brought that up earlier.
No, we talked about ownership, but no, I think it's really
just
good.
saying, okay, there's 20% of the things I need to fix here, and so we take the pain and that we use that as a catalyst to actually improve. And say, okay, what do I need to improve as a part of my business practices? And that kind of comes back to the conversation we had earlier with the contractor friend of mine, where he was able to have that mature response and say, what, this really reflects to the point of, I need to have a few things I need to change.
Yeah.
And number one, making sure he's doing a time and material job, hence why it's stacked up.
Right.
Making sure that's all defined ahead of time.
Yeah.
Where number one, this is my rate. This is how I mark up materials. This is how often I'll bill, et cetera. And that person is saying yes.
Yeah. Upfront expectations.
Upfront. Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote down what he said. I may just read it really quick.
Yeah.
His key takeaway, because we had a phone call with him, just kind of like recapping too. He was like, I'm really pissed off, but I need to use this anger to improve my business and processes. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I'm going to be pissed off at everyone all the time. Yeah, I thought that was a really good takeaway,
right.
You know, because I'm like, okay, yeah, you're going to see the worst in everything if you like let the emotion drive it and not take ownership, not learn from it, those kind of things. So I thought that key takeaway was so good because I'm like, yeah, he's pissed, but he's like focusing that emotion energy on like, well, how can he be better, you know, to improve it? Otherwise, he's going to hate everybody.
And you can become very cynical, right?
Right.
Yeah. You can just be like, you know, the customers will cheat you. Those stinking customers. You feel, I mean, a lot of times we talk like that, contractor to contractor too, like, you know, the customer, you know, but like not in a good way.
Right.
You know, like they'll cheat
the customer is definitely not always right. You know, right?
Well, that's a fact. Many times wrong. But then a lot of times it's discovering, well, maybe their idea of right and my idea of right are two different things. That's usually what it comes down to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No, that's good.
And I think the other thing is we talked about just like the terms of, you know, you brought up the estimate part about how clear, you know, how important that is, I guess, making sure everything's defined.
Yeah. Time
and materials is a tough one to bill. And if you're doing it, bill regularly. I mean, I think a good rule of thumb is how much can you afford to lose? And that's how often you should be billing. And maybe that's every couple of days.
Right.
You know, if that's all you can afford to lose, you just get paid every week. And if you don't get paid, then you just stop work.
Right. You go somewhere else and work for somebody else.
Right.
Like that's the reality. Yeah. Right.
I mean, and if and that way you can resolve things in the moment.
Yeah.
Somebody says, well, that seems high.
Yeah.
Well, you're dealing only 1 week. That can be sorted out, not a month.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can you, I mean, just even thinking through like preventing this, how can you say I'm working through an estimate, I'm writing my terms and conditions, like my actual like payment process. What's that going to look like to a customer? I guess if I'm new in the space, because I don't know this answer, so I'm asking you, is what is a valid like payment schedule to set in your terms and conditions, right? Like, is it you want to put all your material costs in in a deposit so that you're not losing on that? Maybe you're, you know what I mean? And then the payment schedule from there on labor, like what's an ideal? I know this is a whole nother topic we're kind of getting into right now. We won't go too deep into it. But I'm just curious, like, what's a fair like payment terms to put in a contract or an agreement or a proposal?
And I think you're going to hear different answers from different people. My perspective on it is it's somewhat dependent on where you're at as a business and who your client is.
Got it.
So what I mean by that is if you're a remodeler, handyman, contractor like that, you pretty much want to stay ahead of the client in some respect where you're saying, okay, they're in the know and they can always walk away and you can walk away and there's no harm done.
Yeah.
So you're saying, okay, I'm going to buy materials. You're going to pay for those materials.
Got it.
And maybe a week or two billing schedule.
Okay.
Put that in your terms. You know, if you're an established business, 2 weeks is probably not too laborious for either one of you to keep up with.
Yeah.
So 2 weeks, I expect a check. And it's not based on progress necessarily in the sense of I'm sorry, let me rephrase that.
Okay.
And not based on milestones. It's more based on progress of work.
Job,
That's what I mean. Yeah, where we're going to bill out what happened in the last 2 weeks, whether it was $1,000 or $100,000.
Sure. Yeah, and then that way you're actually making money along the way. It's not just like, you know, because if you went the materials route, it's like, okay, well, your materials are covered, but like you're not getting paid as part of the process, you know, too. So it's interesting. Yeah.
And if you're an established business, I think really where you're working for more industrial clients, and I mean, strangely enough, a lot of people with a lot of money take a very long time to pay. I mean, I've talked to several people where they're trade contractors for big cities, municipalities, and it takes them 60, 90 days to get paid on projects so maybe even having that conversation ahead of time with whoever your client is and saying, I know, what are the typical terms? Am I going to get paid in 3 months or am I going to get paid in a month and a week?
Sure.
And you can decide whether or not you want to work for that client at that point, and then get that in writing. So, because I think that's where things can you can get into it real deep. You're paying, you're the banks.
Yeah.
You don't want to be in the position where you're the bank.
Yeah.
And my dad's an architect and builder too, and his model is just bill in advance and keep a kind of a deposit, a rolling deposit on hand where you're never into it with them.
Yeah.
The problem with that can get to the tail end of a job is how do you reconcile everything at that point?
Sure.
Because eventually a deposit runs into where you're just down to a punch list and you're out of money. So, you know, and they will owe you something at some point.
Yeah.
So I think regular payment schedule, even in that case of like, well, we only got this much done on the punch list, but we still expect a payment. This kind of hold back mindset of we're going to hold back the client. They get the idea. We're going to hold back enough money to make it worth it your while to fix whatever. I've got burned by a few times by that.
That's interesting.
You know, with the tail end of the job, they add a bunch of things on. And it's like, okay, let's get those add-ons paid ahead of time. I think at the tail end of a job.
Yeah, it's interesting. You spoke to like time and materials too a couple times. And like one of the things that you've mentioned, I think before and, you know, even today, was avoid time and materials. It was interesting. We had that conversation with your friend a little earlier too. And what was said up front was like, hey, here's this list of like 6 things that I need done. And then he goes to the job and then it's actually like a list of like 25 things, right? Like, can you talk through that of like, here's why to avoid time and materials or what to do? You know, you mentioned like stopping work whenever it's, you know, something has changed, right? So speak to that a little bit too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Time and materials gives your customer the feeling of your time is worth a certain dollar amount per hour, and really it's relational to the time that you're there. And you're saying, okay, if it's $50 an hour, $100 an hour, $150 an hour, your time is worth a certain amount of money. The interesting thing about that equation, though, is you can have somebody very, very good that spent a lot of time getting very good at their craft, spend a lot of their life getting to the point where they're good at it, and they're equated to somebody that might be new at it.
Yeah.
You know, where $20 an hour might be a ripoff in one scenario, and $100 an hour might be a ripoff to the other guy the other direction, where you're underpaying him at $100 an hour because he's so good at it. So time and materials sort of robs you of that value proposition. And sometimes it's an essential, like you don't know the scope of something. So I don't want to be too blanket statement with it. But I think just using it as a universal business practice is the wrong way of going about it. And then the other part about it is the flip side of it, your client's perspective going into it. Is saying, I don't know what this is going to cost. So it's how do you set expectations? So they just keep getting bills. Where's the end of it? So as opposed to going in ahead of time of giving them some numbers of saying, okay, well, even when it comes down to even this piece is going to take $10,000, and this piece I don't know what it's going to cost because you know it's not scoped well enough to know. So that might be a scenario where you need to say part of it's time and materials, but the other part we do know.
It's interesting because in the scenario the story we kind of talked about, it was a time and materials scenario. And so it's like, to your point, he's not actually setting a line in the sand of like, hey, I need to stop work here and actually like have a conversation of like, you know, you're maybe talking round numbers of budget, maybe 10 to 14,000, whatever that range is. There's a round budget, but you're not ever stopping to like have that conversation when you're getting close to.
So it's time and materials, but you had this conversation ahead of time where we're saying it's about $15,000 time and materials, but people don't know what are you going to get done for that. They don't know what's The point is definitely where do you stop is when we need to realign expectations. That's when you stop work. When things aren't aligned anymore. You had we're working together on a project and I'm the client, you're the builder, and I say, I want this done as a part of what you're doing, and you're saying, well, that's not what we talked about before, so let's get things realigned.
So that you get paid. And you don't just say yes to things and then not get paid because it's a surprise to the
We all show up to work. We all want to get stuff done. We have crews, we have people, or just our own time that's valuable, so when we show up, we want to get stuff done. And so when somebody says, oh, but what about this? It's tempting to just say, well, keep working. We'll sort that out later. No, nothing like the moment.
Pump the brakes.
Pump the brakes. I do love that. Yeah. And then, we've talked about this too. I think at the end of the day, when you have this disagreement, you have a situation, it's probably best you don't work for certain people. You can sometimes learn of saying, that's not the client I want to work for. But how do I create good systems and processes in place where they don't get into me too deep, where I don't get paid? I think that's the lesson that I've had to learn. When somebody's out a month and a half on paying me, that's can't end well usually. As opposed to just keeping current with it. And if something goes sidewise, the most we can lose is a couple weeks. Not that we want to lose that. But it's
better than a month and a half.
Oh boy.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh, that's good.
So if we were to summarize this, Kinsey, what are the things that you take away from this?
I think in terms of avoiding it, that's the biggest thing to me, because I'm like, hey, yes, if you are willing to sit down, take ownership, learn from it, like you got to deal with the situation at hand, obviously. But then it's like, how do you avoid it again? Like that's the whole goal of this is like to get better, right? Like I want to get paid every job. And so I think just to like kind of summarize, like make sure communication is excellent. Expectations are set up front. Expectations are set verbally, but they're also in your terms of your, estimate, your agreement. You've talked through that. Anytime you get to a point in the project where something changes, stop. Like to your point, I mean, those kinds of things make a lot of sense so that way you can kind of rehab the conversation. It evokes trust. It builds loyalty, I think, if you're having those conversations. And then, one of the things we had also talked about that I think we kind of left out so far was make sure that you're talking to the decision maker of the job, right? Like they're the ones likely signing the estimate or the contract or the agreement. So and so that was one thing that I just kind of took away from our previous conversation too of, if maybe your contact is not the person who signed the contract or the one paying the bill. So like, how do you keep people in the loop that are like behind the, paying the bill, but are not like as close to the actual project itself, if that makes sense?
Totally. Yeah. If you're not talking to the decision maker and you're talking to the manager in between, right. Yeah, you do need to get that person looped in because they're the ones that actually they write the check. Yeah,
and they're like, well, I didn't see that, maybe or whatever. They've got a totally different perspective if they're not also being communicated with. So like just keeping all parties, all decision makers, because it might be husband and wife too,
Just thinking
like that scenario of like, well, who's actually the decision maker? Hopefully you'll learn that as part of the like scoping qualifying phase.
Yeah.
One should kind of come up, but you never know. And so making sure both are looped in on those conversations and not just assuming that who that decision maker is, I think is important.
They might not talk to each other and you might be talking to one party that didn't care and the other one did.
Yeah, and the other one's the one managing finances or whatever, you never know. So
yeah, or they influence the other one that's paying for it.
Right.
Hey, we're not, couples come to an agreement on perspectives and emotions and feelings about things that influence each other's. One guy was okay with paying it until the wife said, well, he did this and didn't do that. And remember when he mentioned that didn't happen, or vice versa. Yeah. It could be either side. Yeah.
So good.
This is good stuff. Yeah, that's a good summary, Kinsey. And I think this will help us avoid from being, this comment where my friend is just feeling a general frustration with everybody.
Yeah.
And I think we can actually learn from these situations. And then they have resolution. You have said, okay, we've got a good process in place now. Yeah. We're going to get paid. We're going to get through this. And don't be angry at yourself. Don't beat yourself up about this. I mean, I've been there. You've been there.
Totally.
Most of our audience has been there.
Probably everybody in business everywhere has been there, but yeah.
And I think if we just focus on saying, what can we learn from the situation? And even when we feel like I'm dealing with a total crook, sometimes in those situations there is law. There are laws. Sure. There are, even in that situation, I've had somebody that didn't pay zero for an entire project. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, and fortunately it wasn't, a huge sum of money, but I'm thinking to myself, is it worth me going and chasing this guy down? Yeah, I'm sure he's cheating other people, when it's zero. Like there's no negotiation. I think when you're dealing with an outright thief is different from dealing with somebody you can negotiate with. When they just say, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not going to negotiate with you, I'm not going to pay you anything. I think that's a different conversation from one today. But we're kind of assuming that we had some relationship, some rapport, there was some sort of level of friendship, and then you just assume like, let's work together, let's resolve, let's work something out here. Yeah. And even if you're dealing with a thief, you still start there, and then you realize, okay, this person's just wanting to rob me.
Right. And hopefully if you have a payment schedule and things like that, you're realizing that that's the cadence before the end of the project.
Right.
Right? Like if you're, like, oh, the full sum of money is owed at the end.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're going to get the whole job. You're not going to make any money, in that scenario. But it's like, if they're not paying the first payment, again, stopping work so that you're not losing tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah. And maybe it's just $2,500.
Probably one hack in this whole thing too is to make sure that you're putting setting time aside to get your billing and invoicing done. Like half a day a week or, a day a week, whatever it takes.
Yeah.
If it's you doing it or somebody else doing it, make sure it happens.
Yeah.
It just has to happen.
Have to set time. Yeah. It's so good.
It's good stuff.
So good.
Love to get some feedback from our audience on this too.
Yeah. Leave reviews, comments, like it, share it, subscribe it. We want to hear from you guys. And so
yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a personal topic as we headed into it. It's like, oh man, this is going to hit home with so many of us.
It's a painful topic. Yeah.
Well, Kinsey, thanks.
Yeah,
This has been fun.
Have a good one.
All right. You too.
See you.